Africa's kind of Africa's natural gas industry, and specifically looking at the kind of LNG potential of the continent. I wanted to kind of start by trying to kind of set the scene a little bit. I mean, a few statistics. Africa produces about 265 billion cubic meters of gas in 2023. About 80% was in 4 countries: Algeria, Egypt, Nigeria, and Libya. And about 60% of that is exported from the continent as liquefied natural gas. I mean, the gas industry is going through a kind of period of kind of significant upheaval in the last 2 years. I mean, initially started by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which then led to a kind of a scramble, at least in Europe, for access to non-Russian gas. Khady, maybe I can start with you at Kosmos, because you have your own LNG project in Northwest Africa. Has Africa benefited from that scramble for non-Russian gas?
Always a pleasure of meeting you. I'm honored to be here today as Senegal is joining this club of African gas producer that you just mentioned. As you said, Senegal will be producing very soon LNG, and will be exporting this LNG outside the country. It's a project that will, transform Senegal as it moves to the subsequent phases of the project. Yes, to respond to your question on the opportunity that Russia and Ukraine crisis created for Africa and for Senegal particularly, it has created an opportunity. We've seen after this crisis, in the middle of this crisis, many countries knocking at our door to understand when the gas would be available and to understand more about those projects. We saw, a lot of interest in the project, and I think that, the crisis is an opportunity for our countries, and it has put Senegal on the map. And we personally join missions in Europe to showcase, our project. And the interest is very, very strong. Although at that time, when we were meeting potential buyers, we had no gas. The gas was not even ready. But still, people were interested in Europe to know when the gas would be available. So I think that this dilemma of, energy security question that has been created in Europe with the crisis is giving us an opportunity to provide gas to Europe and to able Europe to diversify, its supplier. It's not just a question of replacing the volumes, but it's also a question of diversifying the potential suppliers of gas. And in that story, Senegal is definitely going to play its role.
Abimbola, in Nigeria, have you had the same experience? I mean, I think First EMP provides gas to Nigeria LNG, which itself is a big producer, right? Exports about 7% of global supply. Is there kind of increased interest in the last 2.5 years in Nigeria's LNG export capacity?
Certainly. I mean, First EMP is in the process of providing gas to an LNG. We haven't actually started that supply. But that also came about because of the interest in gas from Nigeria into the European markets. And yes, we have seen a lot of interest based on the scarcity, or the assumed scarcity of supply because of the Russia-Ukraine war. And has Nigeria benefited from LNG supply generally? I would say yes. Because if you look at LNG, for instance, it has created immense job opportunities in Nigeria. So if you take at the start of an LNG, they had contributed about 35,000 jobs. And the current Train 7, I gather, is going to contribute about 40,000 jobs. So there is immense benefit both from the opportunity to supply gas. So the upstream providers are basically looking to develop the abundant gas resources available in Nigeria. But there's also these projects also create economic development opportunities. So I would say it's been quite an interesting period for Nigeria.
I believe about 60% of the gas that's produced in Africa gets exported as LNG. I mean, and I guess in terms of local consumption of gas, actually, I mean, most of that is happening in Egypt and Algeria. So in Senegal, the vast majority is going to be exported. In Nigeria, the vast majority is going to be exported. Just wondered, as you think about developing Africa's gas assets, do we have the balance right at the moment between how much is planned to be consumed locally and how much is going to be exported? And what do you think is the best approach for an African government developing its gas assets? Should it see it as a kind of domestic kind of source of potential power generation, or should it just see it as an export commodity? What do you think, Khady?
I think we have to do both. Obviously, the project I've just mentioned between Senegal and Mauritania is an export project, but we all know this statistic about the 600 million Africans without electricity. When I put that into the context of Senegal, it gives you 30% of the population without electricity. It gives you 75% of the population without access to clean energy sources for cooking. So there is a need for domestic gas to supply to the countries for it to generate power, but not only to, resolve the baseload issue, but also to give access to cheaper electricity, because this is also a challenge. So it's true that at the moment we are talking about export projects, but this has also to be tied to domestic gas projects because of the constraints that we have in terms of power generation and in terms of the need to electrify our countries. We have issues financing those projects. So a very, I would say, creative way that we have found in Senegal is to tie our LNG project to domestic gas projects so that we could, generate revenues from our exportation so that, we could fuel and finance the domestic gas project. Because as we were saying here and as I heard since this morning, financing is a problem. So this is a creative way of, financing the domestic gas project, but definitely there needs to be a right balance between the two. There needs to be domestic gas, I would say, associated to the LNG because of the needs we are facing in Africa and in Senegal in particular. I like to give the example of Senegal because it's my country, but it's also because there is a very clear energy plan with an energy mix that is going to evolve towards, of course, greater renewable, but that is also going to replace HFO by, domestic gas generated in country. And this is going to resolve the problem of electricity, but this is going to also release significant amount of dollars that the government is currently using to subsidize the electricity that is produced in Senegal. So this domestic gas project that we are going to, pursue in the country will not only give access, it's going to provide cheap electricity, but it's going also to release resources to the government. And if I want to give you a figure, we are talking about $600 million that will be released back to the government with those projects, and that the government will be able to use in terms of developing the transportation, the transmission, the infrastructure, the power plants, etc., etc.
Abimbola, is there a similar debate in Nigeria?
Certainly. I mean, there needs to be a balance. Do we need to supply gas into the international markets? Yes. However, we also need to supply gas into the domestic markets. And the interesting thing about the gas resources in Africa is there's certain countries with abundant resources and there's certain countries that do not have. And there needs to be a solution for basically transporting gas from not just to meet the domestic need, but regional needs. There's a real need for diesel substitution. And if the gas molecules can be delivered at cheaper costs to the current use of diesel or even coal, then it's basically boosts the industrialization of Africa. As she said earlier, there's a need generally for electrification, and therefore we have to unlock the bottlenecks that is that's basically limiting the growth in supply of gas into African markets. And one of the things that First EMP is doing at the moment is actually looking into that. As I said, we're starting with the low-hanging fruit of essentially sending about 100 million scf of gas into LNG. But we are actively looking at sending bigger volumes into the regional markets, and we're collaborating with the financiers, governments, and even the end users to understand how to make this value chain bankable and work for all the parties, so from the upstream in terms of production of gas to the midstream in terms of the right infrastructure for the transportation of this gas, liquefaction and transportation of this gas to the relevant markets, not just in Nigeria, but in other countries in Africa as well. So there is certainly a need to balance this demand.
In terms of kind of supplying gas regionally, from what you've looked at, is the best option liquefaction and so LNG shipments to other African countries, or are you talking about international gas pipelines to move gas into landlocked countries, for example?
So certainly not international gas pipelines. However, we're still looking into the value chain to see what works best. Yep. Obviously, there are areas where they're landlocked and you don't actually have the ports to actually deliver LNG. You have to understand how the last mile for those areas work, and that's an area that we're looking into at the moment. So I think the short answer is, at the moment, we're still working on that to understand what works, but pipelines across countries, there's WAPI, there's pipelines that have already been built, but for individual industry, participants in industries to build those pipelines is quite a tall order. Obviously, if people come together and work as a partnership with government, that could work. But we are looking at basically more economical ways of actually getting that gas across.
Interesting what you think about that, Khady. The potential for supplying African LNG to other African countries. And also interested what your views on the pricing mechanism to do that. Because one of the problems we saw during the energy crisis, post-Russia-Ukraine, we saw LNG prices go through the roof. I can't think of any African examples, but if we think about in South Asia, Sri Lanka, kind of Pakistan, that was previously importing LNG, suddenly kind of found they didn't want to pay the sky-high prices, and so they kind of reverted back to coal. But I imagine the similar thing would apply in many African countries. Mm-hmm. If you had another major global disruption which saw LNG prices skyrocket, then would LNG be affordable? So I guess that question is, can LNG be affordable? Can African LNG be affordable for other African buyers? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because with the Russia and Ukraine war, we saw that the prices just skyrocketed. So you would imagine that, if you had locked your price, at a certain level, there is an opportunity lost somewhere. But it can work also the other way around. You could lock at a price and see price drop, and then make an opportunity gain. So I think that it's all about balancing the portfolios and making sure that you have a bit of both, so that you can benefit when there is a market upside, but get also a minimum price that you would get, because if you want to get financing, you need to know, at what price you're going to sell and how many, what would be your cash flow to be able to repay the banks. So I think that a little bit of both maybe could play out so that we could benefit in case of higher prices, but also secure ourselves if the prices are dropping. I just wanted to, talk about this regional project, and I think that there are a response also because we are working in economic zones type of in Africa. In West Africa, you have the WAMU zone. Central Africa, you have the CIMAC. So I think that trying to optimize our resources, trying to optimize the project, trying to optimize the financing that we are seeking abroad, I think would be a response to all this. We are sharing one common currency in 8 African countries. This is also a plus in terms of protecting ourselves from fluctuations. So I think that there are ways to optimize things. There is in West Africa, the West Africa Power Sharing Initiative that is aiming at, sharing the power between countries that have surplus to power, the ones that need some. So there are a lot of initiatives around, but we need to make sure that we optimize those so that we can secure prices, we can secure the supply, we can make sure that the demand is met, and we make sure that down the road our countries can benefit from our resources.
Thinking about prices, I think the general view is that LNG prices should fall in the second half of this decade because there's a massive forecast increase in supply, so 30% increase in global LNG supply, largely coming from the US East Coast projects and from Qatar between 2025 and 27. What's the implications of that glut for African projects? Is that positive or negative? What do you think?
So that's interesting because I think that for African projects, if they can, the debate or the challenge will be the issue of pricing. If African projects can be developed and at very low prices, applying technology, and basically ensuring that the value chain economics work at those low prices, then we can compete. However, we can't lose sight of the fact that there is demand within Africa that we also have to balance out. And that could actually hedge in terms of the cost of investment in these projects. So yes, should Africa try to compete even in the midst of the glut? I would say yes, if we can get the molecules to the market at the right prices, competitive prices. There's also the issue of supply. Our projects have to have security of supply in order to compete. So there's need to continue to invest in upstream gas production at very low unit development costs to ensure that when the LNG comes to market, it is competitive with the world markets. But I would always say that there's also need to focus on balancing that with meeting the demand locally and regionally in Africa.
Given that LNG is an international commodity and there's lots of questions about the future of the global energy system and the role of gas in that system, do you get as kind of oil and gas producers, do you feel that you're in a rush? So if effectively should Senegal be in a rush to develop its assets? Kosmos has a second project, right, GTA, which is not yet finalized. Is there a kind of sense that Senegal needs to get the regulatory framework in place, needs to make sure the contracts are signed so that project definitely gets developed and doesn't effectively miss its opportunity?
Absolutely. I think that the momentum needs to be kept. We have already